You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare, hosted by Mick Cook, brought to you by Hollow Street Media.
Technology's come a long way. Just ask the undergrads who are using ChatGPT to submit their assignments, although I've heard it's not going as well as some people planned. There's lots of autonomous systems out there. Some of them are doing poetry, some of them are doing painting, some of them are fighting wars. But what happens when you start using autonomous systems, and how do you trust them? Is it still a war, or is it just property damage? G'day listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host Mick, and this is our 2023 season, and I know that we've got some new listeners because I know I lost a lot of old listeners with our season last year when we only released 2 episodes. I would apologise for that, but you were getting it for free, so I actually don't need to because I don't owe you anything. But if you are now one of our paid subscribers, I do owe you something, and luckily each guest we get to come on the show does give you a little bit of a bonus in their premium question answer. But thank you for all the support we've seen this year upon our return. It has been absolutely fantastic. Now today I want to talk about trusted autonomous systems, the ethics of using autonomous systems, and how that influences things such as command. Now I could talk about it all day and you would learn absolutely nothing, so I've decided to get a guest in who knows a lot more about it. My guest today is Dr Kate Devitt. She is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist researching the ethics of robotics, autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence. She is also an entrepreneur. She is the CEO and co-founder of Better Beliefs, an evidence-based stakeholder engagement platform for justified and actionable decision-making. Kate has worked in defence for the last 6 years, most recently as Chief Scientist of Trusted Autonomous Systems Defence Cooperative Research Centre, and before that, a social and ethical robotics researcher for the Defence Science and Technology Group, commonly known as DSTG. Kate, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mick. It's a pleasure to be on your show, and it's a great podcast that you run. I'm really glad you're back on for the 2023 season, and of course, I'm very humbled and honoured to be a guest. So thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Kate. And that's a lesson for all those other guests that haven't mentioned how honoured they are to come on the show. Just letters in the mail. Now, Kate, before we start discussing your research and recent article on meaningful command, and like your research I've been following for a while, and when I was doing business development for a university, I used to enjoy some of the benefits some of our researchers got from Trusted Autonomous DCRC. I also used to rue the day with some of the funding that was going your way because I wanted that funding for our own projects. But you guys won out because it was a very good initiative for helping industry and researchers collaborate in the defence space. But we're not here to talk about that, and listeners have heard me talk about that a lot. You're here to talk about meaningful command. But before that, so our listeners get to understand where you're coming from, I'm keen to understand what motivated you to study the ethics of autonomous systems in the military domain.
Yeah, great question, Mick. I think my background in philosophy and cognitive science, I taught applied ethics at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in America, where I did my PhD. So I've always been interested in applied ethics. I think grounding ethics in real-world problems actually benefits the study of ethics itself, because with that complexity and the parameters of the messiness of the real world, it's really hard to make a good decision. And so I think military decision-making is one of the fields of ethics where sometimes there are no good decisions, where people are forced to make a terrible decision, and they are trying to find a path through that terrible decision. And that, for me, is some of the most difficult and perhaps the most challenging, and then potentially the most rewarding place to apply oneself. It's not for everyone. I think for some reason it's an area that I seem to be able to put myself into the perspectives of many different types of decision makers. I also really respect the warfighter and those who serve and who have signed that contract with their governments to serve. I think that is a very, very important and different commitment than almost anyone else in society makes. So I also stand to listen most of all to those who serve and to hear from them, and then to try and triangulate based on perhaps some of the more scientific theories that I read about in philosophy or cognitive science, and to bring those scientific theories, but lightly, into those military decision challenges, and then to again listen and see how the military responds to that science, because the science often has missed something. You know, sometimes those scientists are sitting in their ivory towers doing controlled experiments and trying to make determinations about the way the mind works or the way humans operate, and someone who's actually been in an operation could have an insight that simply hasn't even been thought about to be tested, let alone tested properly or scientifically. So I love that interplay between different kinds of experts, and I like listening to those expertises and then try to navigate a path forward just to make those incremental changes to our understanding, standing on the shoulders of others, including those who serve.
Just pulling one of those threads, I really like the way you talked about the ivory towers. People doing meaningful work, they just don't know they're in a tower sometimes, and having operational experts. And, I went from, Helmand province in Afghanistan to a year later supporting a scientific project on attack guidances. And, often I was asked the question, in this situation, what would you have done last year? Although one, I would have tried to avoid being in this situation, but two, generally we only had a couple of options and none of them were good. It's very different from the sterile experimental world, but you still need those, and it's good to see that there's a way for those expertises to be linked up through people such as yourself, writing good works like your latest chapter that's coming out. I don't think it's been released yet, but it will be very soon. Meaningful Command, and it discusses advanced control directives as a method to enable moral and legal responsibility for autonomous weapon systems. Now, I find this absolutely fascinating because in my military career, we didn't have autonomous weapon systems, but we had some pretty cool stuff to enable us to do some very tough type of work. But now it's becoming much more challenging, I suppose, for the commander. Are you able to provide our listeners with a summary of what this chapter is about?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, Mick. So the chapter was motivated by my experience working in defence and trying to contend with whether it would ever be justified to use autonomous weapon systems in a conflict. Following the United Nations CCW, GGE laws meetings where some want to have a ban on autonomous weapon systems, certainly there is a very active group, the Ban Killer Robots campaign, that has a lot of traction in society. And if on the face of it, it seems like absolutely we don't want killer robots. That would be bad. Now, militaries don't want uncontrollable killer robots any more than they want uncontrollable killer humans. They want controllable things. So when militaries contend with this societal concern about killer robots, sometimes the military response is, but we wouldn't want to have something that was uncontrollable or unpredictable. So why do we need to ban something that we wouldn't want to have anyway? Mm-hmm. So there's a sort of tension between stakeholders. And so I wanted to get to the bottom of the tension to some degree, at least from the perspective I could offer, and find out perhaps where some of the logic was struggling. So this is what a philosopher does, is you say, well, what's the logical problem here that we're trying to solve? And what's the capability we want to enable for an effective military that also wants to hold themselves high internationally with international reputation and standing? Some might see that as incompatible, but ethics is not incompatible with military behaviours. And in fact, we can see in the Ukraine that being on the right side, acting justly for just reasons and not committing war crimes has worked to the Ukrainian favour at a global level. And that being a nation that behaves itself both in the decision to go to war as well as in the conduct of warfare itself will have negative consequences for those individuals and for the nation. So we mustn't lose track of how important it is to conduct ourselves appropriately, but nevertheless effectively with that asymmetric advantage to be frightening to our enemies and to make our enemies fear to engage with us. This is complicated, but it is the nature of war. So I think that was the philosophical challenge for me. How do you do it? How do you be effective and threatening, but behave in a way that we can defend ourselves internationally by reputation? So let me tell you what I think is the essentially logically problematic basis for the chapter. So Mick Ryan, in his book War Transformed, he talked about 7 different trends of 21st century warfare, but I'm just going to focus on 3 that were relevant to the chapter. One is the increasing speed of planning, decision-making and action. 2, large-scale conventional forces combined with the massed use of autonomous systems and extensive influence tools. And 3, human-machine integration. Autonomous systems will be full partners with human beings in the conduct of military missions. So you often hear industry talk about how they're going to enable faster decision cycles and to move assets more quickly through the battle space, because that, of course, is seen as an asymmetric advantage. The problem is that human beings, their cognition can't be sped up past a certain point. So there are conditions of warfare and decision-making that are well documented in the military history books that are designed around a certain pace, a certain temporal flow of operations, even in the fog of war and in congested decision-making. Autonomous systems might speed that up, but also conversely, they could slow things down. So if you think about submarine operators, when we moved from the Oberon class of submarines to the Collins class, there was a reduction in how many people we needed on board. So Oberon had about 80, whereas Collins went down to 60, and there was a lot more automated functions on those submarines. So you no longer needed to crank the doors shut to go snorkel. You had to you could use software to solve problems, but the Collins class teams didn't thrive mentally in those conditions sometimes, because when you automate a lot of functions, it can become boring for human beings as well. And if humans are not engaged and they're not paying attention, then when they need to pay attention, they might not be. And so what we need with our autonomous systems as we're bringing them into service, we need to be very mindful of the conditions under which humans pay good attention and are useful decision makers and reasoners, and circumstances where it's okay to offload some tasks to autonomous functionality, as long as those autonomous systems are able to signal to humans at the right moments when they need an intervention. I'll just give you a nice example of an autonomous system that's currently in service in Australia. The OCS Bluebottle is an autonomous craft that is going out from Darwin now, and it is moving around up there and surveilling those waters up north of Australia. Most of the day, they are autonomously operating. They get to make decisions for themselves because for the most part, the ocean is empty, boring, and not dangerous. But it doesn't have collision avoidance on board. And so when it needs assistance to comply with COLREGs, that's collision avoidance at sea, you have these remote operators in Randwick and Sydney, and they actually intervene on the system, and then they can help the Bluebottle manoeuvre around that obstacle. So that interplay between autonomy function and then human intervention is the kind of operational environment that we're seeing immediately today and is likely to continue into the future. And for militaries, as they build more autonomy capability, they're going to need to figure out, how do we set up our systems so that we can deploy them and still remain ethically and legally responsible for their operations, but we may not be able to intervene on them if they are on an operation moving really quickly outside of one's control. I thought is that possible? That's my question for the chapter is that possible? And I have a solution. So
that's excellent. It's good that you've got a solution as well, because posing difficult questions is supposed to be my job, and your job is supposed to come up with the solutions. But it's really interesting. We've come a long way from, when I was in Afghanistan and we had Reapers and other UAS. theatre level UAS, controlled from guys sitting in Nevada, right? That was, for us I'm old now, but for us oldies, that was wow, right? So this is weird. Is this meaningful control? Like that whole system was constantly being controlled and piloted. In fact, I saw a Reaper pilot and a fast jet pilot get into an argument in a bar in northern England over this because one called himself a pilot. They both called themselves a pilot, and one disagreed vehemently that the other one was a pilot. But now we're getting to the point where those operators they view it differently, which leads to this concept of meaningful control. You talk about this in your chapter. What exactly is meaningful human control?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very philosophical question, and it's a contentious answer.
Yeah.
What is meaningful? Well, there is no legal requirement for meaningful anything. Okay, so the phrase meaningful human control has emerged in the narrative, particularly around those autonomous weapon systems in the last 10 years or so. And it's trying to triangulate around trying to keep humanity involved in the actions of warfare, I think. And from that perspective, it's a really important insertion because it's trying to say that war is a political act through use of force. We have to keep the humans involved in those acts. I think that's where the meaningfulness comes in. And the concern is that you would have these Black Mirror, terrifying science fiction cases where you might have swarms of robotic dogs and UAVs that are clever enough to come up with their own plan and their own targets and their own execution of the plan and the targeting to harm humanity, and that has then severed the connection to a human's intent, but also their responsibility, because a human could say, or a set of humans could say, well, I didn't intend to harm those other humans. That was something that was determined by this swarm of dogs and UAVs. And if anyone is following at home with not just ChatGPT or the LLM revolution, but inventions like AutoGPT. So AutoGPT is where you actually give a broad task to the AI, and the AI figures out how to solve that task as well as ask itself questions that might prevent it from achieving that task. And in the news in the last couple of weeks, there was a lot of brouhaha because there was an announcement that in a simulated run-through, an AI had killed human operators because the human operators were trying to stop it from achieving its objective. Willing to destroy communications equipment or destroy, the humans in charge of them in order to achieve an objective. So there is a concern that's a very old concern, and you can actually see this go all the way back through mythology and history in human culture. The idea that it's dangerous to wish for things, right? The genie, be careful what you wish for. Or if you talk to a witch, be careful what spell you ask the witch to have. Macbeth, it's this old idea that humans may not know how to ask for something that is what they actually want to achieve, or the interpretation of their wish can go extremely badly. Yeah. So I think meaningfulness gets back to this very, very deep human issue with actually figuring out what they want and then actually achieving that thing. And therefore, we need to figure out how to lasso or control the intent, actions, planning, decision-making of any autonomous assets we use in a military to ensure that in the long arm of history that human beings can say, I made that decision. That was my fleet of autonomous assets. I told them to do exactly what they did. And yes, maybe they made a few decisions for themselves and they decided to jump over this fence rather than go around the gate. But at the end of the day, I commanded them to behave. They did as they were commanded, and I will take responsibility for what they did. If we don't have that, then we're in real crook shape.
Right. And I mean, I knew when getting a philosopher on the show, one, I would have been out of my depth, but two, there'd be some really cool references, and not too many of my guests reference Shakespeare, so yes, tick in the box. And thinking about what you've talked about with human control and how you summarised the chapter before, and then we get onto the trends in the 21st century war. And my listeners will have heard Mick's episode on his book, War Transformed. I know Mick quite well, and I know he's just released one book, and he's just released his second book, and he's probably writing another one. He's always writing, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's writing another one. So if we take this human meaningful control and then marrying it up with those 3 trends out of the 7 that you talked about, how does this sort of tie together for what we're seeing in robotics and autonomous systems?
Yeah, so my angle into this dialogue was to answer a very specific concern by Peter Azzaro, who is somebody who is very concerned about killer robots. And he said, actually back in 2012, he said, a legitimate lethal decision process must also meet requirements that the human decision maker involved in verifying legitimate targets and initiating lethal force against them be allowed sufficient time to be deliberative, be suitably trained and well informed, and be held accountable and responsible. That quote I took to be my mission. I need to prove to Peter that we can work with autonomous assets ahead of their deployment with enough deliberative time and enough thinking and training so that we are informed, so that we can be responsible. That is the insertion, and that's when I started thinking about other legal precedents in the world that dealt with decision making and deliberation at a time M for actions that would happen in the future at time N, and that contract could be upheld, because if we could get that, then there's the potential to actually deploy autonomous systems at these really faster temporal speeds, or even slowed down very, very slowly. Let's say submarines are chuffing around over periods of years across the oceans without having a huge amount of injection from humans. And that's where I thought, well, what about those advanced care directives in the health sector? Yeah. And that made me really interested. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a philosopher, so I use this medical example not to say that we should shift the legal apparatus from the medical domain into the military domain, but it's to see what lessons we can take from the attempt to come up with these contracts ahead of time. And so advanced care directives emerged from the 1970s when medicine started to have the ability to really keep people alive for a long period of time, but sort of hooked up to all kinds of apparatus. And there were people who were concerned, and they thought, well, actually, I don't want to be plugged in. I don't know if you've got family members like this, Mick, or maybe you're one yourself, which says, look, when I'm done, I'm done. Don't keep me hooked up to those bloody machines. You know, if my brain's gone, I'm not there anymore, unplug me, right? So often we've had this conversation with our loved ones because we want them to know our values at a future time. And that's been codified into a process of advanced care planning and advanced care directives that provide some legal documentation to try and help doctors justify a decision to remove or withdraw life support, for example. So I read a book that really went through the history of these to try and see what lessons we could take for command. And I think there are a lot of lessons there about what would be important in a military training context to ensure that an autonomy commander, so someone who is in command of autonomous assets, was sufficiently informed that there could be a robust legal defence of their actions at a future time. And here are some of the findings from the medical literature. It's no good if you've written an advanced care directive when you're 40 and then the problem happens when you're 70 and you haven't talked to anyone in those intervening periods of time about what your wishes and preferences are. So with advanced healthcare planning, you need to have constant and ongoing dialogues with your medical staff about changing requirements. It needs to be something that happens often, not just once, and you need to demonstrate that you have had a rigorous set of conversations with experts. So translate that to a military domain, it wouldn't be sufficient for a commander to have only a small amount of training with a set of autonomous assets and then to enable that commander to be deployed in the field with them and to expect them to be truly responsible for their behaviours. So kind of immersion that we're going to need, I think, to secure that legal responsibility particularly is just the way we use Google Maps every day to get us from A to B. It's just part of the way you make decisions when you navigate in your car is to use that Google Maps. The kind of day-to-day training and experience with AI and autonomy assets has to be constant and ongoing. And you need to use wargaming to a degree that has not been done to date. So the kind of simulated wargaming environments, of course, the kids of today spend a lot of their lives in gaming and in gaming simulated environments. My son knows that he wants to have a kill switch on a drone because he plays games like Gary's Mod, and he uses drones, and he has beliefs about how to use drones, appropriately. So I think it's within the realm of this generation in particular, and to some that are innovative thinking forward, to imagine that they spend a lot more time in simulated environments making decisions. But the real trick here is you need to either slow down or speed up the simulation with the autonomous assets to get to the sweet point of human cognition. This is not the way it's normally done, in the sense that human factors research tends to work in real time, and they observe humans with user interfaces making decisions, and they try to say this user interface should change because the human's not paying attention at this points A, B, and C. That's real time. I say, look, don't necessarily have to do that. You need to speed up the action so that meaningful moments in time resonate at the point of human cognitive capacity. And so with the OSIS Blue Bottle case, right, the narrative you need for the OSIS case is only the parts where the Blue Bottle needs a human intervention. You don't need to worry about sort of the dead time. So similarly, with autonomy command, in those simulated environments, there'd be a lot of actions that autonomous systems can do in those environments, perhaps to navigate to get to a location, before humans need to interdict with those systems in order to make choices about how they might behave in the simulated environments. And I think through this process, each nation will figure out where their own line is in terms of what kinds of actions and behaviours they would think would be defensible. And we will see those values change over time. It's likely that precedent and real case studies will affect the global judgment with regards to how autonomous systems are deployed and whether they're used in the application of force and in what circumstances that application of force occurs. I mean, we already have automated weapon systems, particularly in countermeasures, that have been used for decades. We've had software supported targeting and systems for decades that the public does not seem to express a huge concern about. So the militaries have used digitized and algorithmic techniques for a long time, and we've used automation for a long time in weapon systems. So it's already there, and the question mark around more advanced uses of systems, I think, will depend on, for example, if it's a just war or not. We've seen in the Ukraine videos of Ukrainian drones hovering over Russian tanks, dropping munitions into Russian tanks, and the general response from the public has been, fantastic, blow those Russians away. Well, we don't know whether that was an autonomous drone or not. So I think the public may not care about autonomy so much as they care about ethical behaviour. It may be that really, if that autonomous function helps the Ukrainians fight and preserve their country against a hostile and unjust attack, that may be acceptable. And we've seen a bit of a change in the last 18 months in the public narrative when there has been what might be said to be an ethical war or an ethical defence of nation and country in the Ukraine, in a way that before then, when we had the ambiguity of fighting non-state actors in the 20 years of the war on terror, where it was really hard to know who combatants were. It was not a defence of country. It was a much harder ethical set of conflicts to find the path for the public, I think. They didn't know how to ground the decisions made in those conflicts to a broader ethical compass. But now, with this current conflict, you're seeing autonomy coming in because it's easier to justify its use.
I was a bit worried when we started talking legal issues, because I've spent a lot of time with lawyers, having a previous career in targeting and now a career in business. And I used to always say, and I actually have translated across both industries, if you can call military service an industry, to the lawyers, I just need you to tell me what's legal because I'm trained in what's ethical. And, but that training comes in practice, right? Doing the practice and understanding the rules and obligations and having that moral and value underpinning. But it was always an interesting conversation because it's hard for legal professionals as well because they are there to help as well. But when we're talking about legal issues as well, when it comes to advanced care directives, to all my friends and family, do not turn me off. Keep me alive as long as you can until they can upload my brain into a mainframe. No, I'm undecided, but I'm probably getting to an age where I probably should start making some decisions. So I probably should call my lawyer, where I'll tell them they just focus on the legal stuff. Now we're going to have a quick pause, and then we're going to go into a premium question for those listeners who subscribe on the Apple app via the paid subscription model. They're the only people that get to listen to this. Everyone else is a little bit too cheap, or you're on Android. And if you're on Android, I do apologise to you. But if you're on Apple and you're using an iOS system and you don't subscribe, I don't really apologise to you because you're getting free content. And now we're back with everyone. That was an amazing answer for our premium question there that was rooted in some very solid military theory as well as the academic rigour of philosophy and ethics, which was good. And I think listeners who heard that will benefit from it. I think listeners who didn't hear from that are dead to me. Now, Kate, we're going to move into our final question now. Our listeners are starting to park their cars. They're starting to get off the treadmill. They want to know what your answer is to the question that everyone gets to answer on this show. So, Kate, my final question is one that I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. I ask each guest to finish the sentence war is. So, Kate, I ask you, can you please finish the sentence war is?
War is the pinnacle of societal organisation for terrible, if sometimes necessary, purposes.
Wow, that's a very good pre-prepared answer. We have had people go off the cuff before and it's never worked well for them, so I like that. War is the pinnacle of human organisation for sometimes terrible but necessary purposes. If I think I got that right, that's a cracker. I can't wait to see what our listeners think about that because definitely have the terrible purpose in there. But having been someone who used to have everything about his day mapped out, there's a lot of organisation there.
There's a lot of organisation, and I guess because I am reading Mick Ryan's latest book on Taiwan, and I'm, reading it, it's well written, it's thoughtful, it's very measured. And I guess one of my motivations around working in defence or around military thinkers is that I have run into so many incredibly smart, capable, trustworthy, brilliant human beings who work in, nevertheless, a sort of terrible profession. And I'm struck by this, that I'm attracted to working amongst these people because I think so highly of them. They are some of the most peak people I know. But none of them would go to war without it being a terrible requirement that is not done lightly by those who I think are very, very worthwhile in paying attention to. So that, I guess, gets to that philosophically interesting challenge about this area for me.
It is definitely one of the worst phenomenons carried out by people with some of the best intentions, I suppose, is one way of thinking about it. And hell, you have to be organised if you go into war because nothing is organised in war. Kate, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mick. Have a good day.
Now, listeners, you can thank Kate for coming on the show by following her on Twitter. You can read her chapter, A Meaningful Command, when it comes out. We'll put a link in the show notes, and we'll promote the hell out of it on Twitter when it comes out. Also, it's there's a version on LinkedIn as well on Kate's LinkedIn profile. So follow her on LinkedIn as well. But if you follow her on Twitter, she's at SK Devitt. She's also, as I said, the co-founder and CEO of Better Beliefs. So follow Better Beliefs by jumping onto their website at betterbeliefs.com.au. And another task for you listeners who are out there listening on Apple Podcasts with your pockets weighed down, throw us some coin if you want, and you can get rid of those pesky ads I put in the show and also have premium content. But if you don't mind listening to ads, that's okay, because every time you listen to ads on the show, I get a kickback as well. So ultimately, there's no listener on the show that I don't find a way to wring some coin out of. But to be honest, advertising doesn't necessarily pay all the bills. So if you are interested in premium content, learning a little bit more what our guests have to say about their topics, please feel free to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. If you use another platform for your podcast content, reach out to us at mick@hollowstreet.com.au. Let me know what your platform is. I can investigate options for providing our premium content through those other platforms. It's just that Apple makes it the easiest for me, and I'm very, very lazy, which is actually something that kind of came up a little bit today in terms of humans being lazy. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is a Hollow Street media production. It is hosted and produced by Mick Cook and co-produced by Brooke Winnell. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Hollow Street Media.